Have you ever been alone outside in the dark of night? And I mean truly alone. Truly in the dark. It prods at something primal in your brain. Every sound is heightened. Every rustle, every shift in your surroundings is a potential threat. What would it be like to live every moment of your life like that? Imagine you're trying to make a decision. Every option pulls you every which way. Imagine those impulses as actual voices in your ear. Voices you cannot silence. Have you ever talked to yourself? I know I do. We often figure things out by having conversations inside our head. Imagine asking yourself a question, and the answer that comes back is in a voice you don't recognize as your own. Imagine these things and you might begin to fathom what it's like to live in Senua's mind. Because Senua knows what it's like. Senua's quest is simple. She must travel to Helheim and confront the god of the dead so that she may free the soul of her departed beloved. Senua promised to return to him, and not even death can break that promise. Her journey into Helheim is fraught with danger. This is a harrowing ordeal full of suffering and demons and monsters crawling in the dark. Most of which, perhaps all of which, live only in Senua's mind in one sense or another. This fact doesn't make them any less deadly, for to lose this battle is to let darkness forever overcome her thoughts. She fights not only the trials of the Northmen, but the poison in her mind. And oh, the pain this poison brings. Senua's pain. Your gut will often clench with Senua's terrible pain. This story doesn't only focus on the encroaching darkness, but also on the courage with which she confronts it. Her resolve sometimes wavers, yet it's only forged stronger through the suffering. They can break her, but not her promise. Even death won't keep them apart.
Through this darkness you will find him. In your sword still beats a heart.
It's a struggle to critique Hellblade as a video game, and not because games can't be serious or tackle complex issues like mental illness. There's plenty of excellent games out there that have already gone that route, though perhaps not as many to the extent that Hellblade does. I struggle with it because Senua's Sacrifice isn't a very good game, but it's an absolute masterpiece of an experience. You see, Hellblade is a journey into a person's mind, and every feature in it is tailored to this experience. Every mechanic succeeds at exactly that, to the detriment of what we'd normally consider enjoyable gameplay. Found in a different game, the mechanics will be riddled with flaws. It would be slow and repetitive and simplistic, infuriating at times. The camera is too close, the field of view far too constricted. The puzzles don't often go above trivial. Enemy variety is lackluster, and if you don't care about spectacle for its own sake, combat can be repetitive. Outside the bosses, there's not much reason to do anything but spam the melee stun and light attack, routinely pulling back to tackle one enemy at a time. It takes too long to walk and jog everywhere, especially backtracking to solve puzzles or look for lore stones you might have missed. Close to the start, the game flat out lies to you in big bold letters, telling you about a permadeath mechanic where there is none. And the live-action performances, mixed in for some of the narrative, features some serious chewing of this scenery.
Hell will not give you the answers you want, but you mustn't look away from the horrors it does offer, because you cannot overcome suffering if you refuse to look at it.
Now, if you're even remotely intrigued by the themes in this game, Dismiss every single point I just mentioned. Seriously, just toss what I just said in the trash and simply buy into the world. Go and experience the incredible journey that is Senua's sacrifice, because the gameplay in this game is exactly what it needs to be. It's near perfect at what it does. I can't fault it for achieving precisely what the developers were after. Yes, the camera remains glued to Senua, close, claustrophobic, like we are right there next to her, like the voices she hears,
Moving towards your death.
like another weight on her shoulders, another pair of eyes passing judgment, another imaginary spirit bearing her burden. We see what she sees, and we see her at all times, constantly aware of her presence, sometimes to the exclusion of her surroundings. Constant self-awareness. That bit about everything being over for good if you die too many times, it's there to play with your mind. I debated not even mentioning it here, but if you're watching this, I'm sure you are the kind to just look it up or test it the moment that the message shows, just like I did. I sure wish I hadn't, because the warning is brilliant and worth the break in immersion. It's there to give weight to the deaths that would otherwise be a character respawning in any other game. It latches a parasite into your thoughts, perhaps giving you yet another taste of what it's like to be inside Senua's head. Figuring out how to advance is chasing delusions in the forest. It's lining up arbitrary symbols. It's pointless. The door wasn't locked to begin with. Sometimes the door isn't even there. We line up light and shattered reality to make a bridge or a staircase, and we know that it was always there all along. And yet it carries so much meaning to open the way forward. It's internally consistent with who we are and what we're trying to do. So much so that you might find yourself believing that the patterns are actually important. Senua fights over and over beastly warriors shrouded in shadow, demons that surround and overwhelm her. She parries, she counterattacks, she dodges and charges, never disengaging, never with the option to back down. Sometimes she flows in a perfect dance, sometimes she flails and blunders. They hurt her more often than not. Sometimes they defeat her. But eventually her blades bite their flesh until they vanish. Even when they fall, Senua is fighting a losing battle. They will return, as they always do. And the voices, they hardly ever relent. Sometimes they're pleasant. In other situations, they are a constant badger, a never-ending stream of contradictory advice, of judgment, of encouragement, of insults. They get annoying at times, insufferable, and you must live with it. You must always live with it. Visions of other people often accost her. Or are they perhaps spirits keeping you company, haunting your journey? Are they guides to your travels? Are they only in your mind? One way or another, it's only natural that they speak as if the world depends upon their every word. As far as Senua knows, it just might. The land is vast, the caves and hallways numerous, and it takes quite some time to traverse them. It can be slow, it can be a real trek between objectives, just like it would be in an actual place. Even with all the improbable architecture, this world feels like an actual place. So often I'd slow down just to take it all in. You can jog in most areas, but still I simply walked. It felt natural, it's what Senua would do. And the puzzles? Well, here's the thing. Every door is already open the moment you get there. The roadblocks, the magic, the patterns and runes and dangerous shadows are all in Senua's mind. The voices in your head, or are they spirits? They mock you for caring about these symbols, while in the same breath they commend you for getting past these trials. And this is no spoiler, by the way. From the beginning it's clear that you're in the same boat as Senua in trying to figure out what's real and what isn't. In fact, you are free to take everything at face value and imagine this young woman is a haunted warrior fighting the actual Norse gods and spirits, going through sacred trials to liberate the soul of her beloved. You can also go entirely the other way and imagine this woman dressed in wild rags and paint on her face is just some villager lost in the woods, and everything she remembers, everything she's seen, is not quite there. including the corpses, the effigies, the Norse sigils. Who's to say how deep her illness goes? I do have one solid, unconditional gripe, and if you've listened to other critiques of mine, it's a complaint you've probably heard before. There is only one save file that's overwritten at arbitrary checkpoints. I'm fine with no multiple saves and no reloads, that's the Dark Souls way, it's not a problem. But I loathe checkpoints. One of the very few things that made me resent this game was having to quit for the day for whatever reason, only to find when I got back that I had to replay a bunch of the walking and cutscenes because I left before the checkpoint happened. I've said it before, I'll say it again. PC games got this right in the 1980s. Let me save wherever I please. Checkpoints are the work of the devil. That issue aside, this game is an incredible experience. A unique experience.
I need this sword. It's important. Can you help me?
It's oozing with Norse mythology, and although I was mildly familiar with it going in, I wasn't aware it was so thoroughly intricate and awesome, and Hellblade does a fantastic job of telling you about it. And I haven't even mentioned how great it looks, because it should be self-evident. This is the best looking game I've ever played, no exceptions. Hellblade knows it, and it comes with a built-in screenshot tool for your pleasure. This is my desktop background right now, I took it myself. Animation quality is without fault, and while the combat is mechanically simple, it looks so good and smooth and badass that I enjoyed every bit of it. Never felt like a chore to fight, especially the times when I got into the flow of things and Senua became an untouchable goddess of rage and swordsmanship. When you're wailing away at the enemy, flowing from one attack to the next as the music swells around you. It'll rouse your skin with goose flesh. The same praise goes for the sound design. It's as close to perfection as sound design can go. You are told to put on headphones at the start for the binaural experience of hearing voices in your head, but a good surround system at full blast will have the same effect. Either way, you're in for a treat. I'll warn you, though, this story is intense, it's terribly painful, and it's not for everybody to enjoy. The actress portraying Senua puts on a deeply heart-rending performance. It's powerful. It's likely to make you weep. And if you can't handle horror or disturbing imagery, you should probably stay away.
Delia. Help me.
Above all, though, if you're interested, go in without cynicism. It's easy to go into critically acclaimed or hyped games with a scoffing, contrarian attitude, looking for flaws to tear it apart. Don't do that with Hellblade. That's my chief advice to you. Buy into the world and embrace the premise. Dive into Senua's mind without reserve. The gods shall reward you for it. The final discussion here contains full spoilers for the story. Turn back now if you don't want them. You see, the mythology is fascinating, the environments are gorgeous, the world is great. But the main draw of this story is Senua herself. We learn everything there is to know about her life as we traverse the trials to make it into Helheim. Due to her illness, she grew up sheltered, extremely so. Her mother also heard voices. Senua had a chance meeting with Dillion in the forest, the young man that she'd eventually fall in love with, the man she's now desperately seeking to free from the clutches of Hela. And what a man he was. He was the bridge that led her to understand there was more to life than her miserable experience, the man that allowed her to wish for something better. But the encroaching darkness never relented, and through narration and flashbacks we learn Senua left for the wilds to face her demons, as her mother once did, allegedly, in the hopes to vanquish the darkness ever looming in her mind. She returns to find her village razed to cinders, and her beloved hung in brutal sacrifice. And this is when Senua's tether to reality snaps. This is the basis of her motivation for the quest she's on, and the reason why she remembers so little of her life before. It's an early tell of her mental state that she carries Dillion's severed head in a sack at her waist. It's the seed of his soul, you see. She'll be needing it to free him. Can we spare a moment to appreciate this, by the way? When Senua shambles into the razed village and finds Dillion's body, his head is still attached. She cut him down, unsheathed her sword, and chopped. Take a moment to imagine yourself doing that with the body of a loved one. That's the kind of frame of mind that Senua is in. As she draws ever nearer to Helheim and she's forced to confront her fears, details emerge from the shrouds clouding her memory. And most of these are memories of her father.
The gods can only fit you through my hand. You're going nowhere.
Abusive in the extreme, he kept her in isolation, cooped up in a dark hole covered in runes for long periods of time, hitting her and berating her and instilling in her the deep shame rooted in her mind. For she bore this terrible curse as her mother did. After many trials, Senua eventually remembers that in his ignorance, he had her mother burned in a pyre to cleanse this curse. Of course, while young Senua watched. He blames her daughter for the plague spreading through the village, and it's this blame that drives her into the wilds to face the darkness inside her. In the end, if you find every single lore stone, it is implied in an additional cutscene that he led the Norsemen to the village in exchange of saving his own life. That last part is told in a pretty vague manner, so I could be totally wrong in that interpretation, but it does help explain why Dillion, of all people, was singled out in such a brutal manner. Senua's father had a good cause to hate the guy, as he was the reason for her defiance. At first I was disappointed about the narrative taking this turn. Though abusive parents are an all too common tragedy, it's become a cliché for tortured character backstories. But more importantly, I felt it diluted the impact of the actual illness that Senua had to deal with. Suddenly, it wasn't just psychosis that held her back, but the far more mundane trauma of parental abuse.
You're pathetic. Rotten. Cursed. What were you thinking? Did you really think you could win? How stupid can you be?
So stupid.
Everyone hates her. She's cursed.
The shadow hates.
Look at you. A warrior. Worthless. Weak. Pathetic. Go on. Feel sorry for yourself, because there's no one left to do that for you.
A terrible thing to be sure, but something we've seen in stories many times before. But then I understood. The father figure is in fact only a proxy. It's a representation of Senua's real tragedy. Because in the end, when Senua comes to terms with what's happened, when she finally lets go of her grief, the lesson we learn, or at least the lesson I took away, is that her illness wasn't even the main source of her misery. Her true nightmares, her terror, the instability, it's all stemmed from the stigma that came alongside her disease. If it were not for the shame and damage to self-worth that all the abuse caused, she would have never left Dillion's side.
They're blaming me for the plague. They say that I'm cursed. What if they're right? What if my father was right?
Senua's story painfully shows that even when our perception of reality is warped, even when our perception of the world is drastically flawed, it's the world's perception of us that truly haunts us.
He glows.